The rain came like a question no one could answer, sheet after sheet of cold water that flattened the town against itself. Streetlights blurred into one another along Meridian, their halos swallowed by the wet. Frank pushed his broom through the puddles, felt the bristles gather grit. Old gum, cigarette butts, the thin crust of a city that had learned to survive on small, stubborn things. He'd been sweeping the same stretch for 8 years. The factory gate and the row of low-priced storefronts that leaned against it, the bus stop where teenagers shuffled umbrellas, the corner where nurses swapped shifts and kept their smiles for the night. 44 in the face, and still young enough for worry to keep its claws. There were bills in a shoebox under his bed. There was a soup of unpaid notices in his kitchen drawer. There was Clare, 11 and exact, who could bake a box of cake mix into something almost like celebration. There was a history of quiet, the kind that spoke more plainly than any shouting. A wife who left a year after the second pregnancy. A landlord who measured kindness by the speed of a check. A town that valued labor until it found a cheaper alternative. On nights like this, Frank told himself the rain washed everything clean. He liked the picture it made, clearing, forgiving, the promise of a morning without layers of grit. He liked the small miracle of a broom that made a line through chaos and left order behind. He had learned to keep his miracles small. Big ones, he thought, needed capital accounts and signatures, and men in suits who wore smiles like armor. He saw the child first as a shape, a misprint on the dark shoulder of the road, a sockless foot, a small fist gripping something close to a chest. For a second, he thought it was a coat snagged on a fence, some abandoned doll. Rain made illusions of everything. Then a tiny voice, the sound of air trying to hold itself together. The child was huddled in a bus shelter, wet hair plastered to the skull, shoes gone. Her jacket had been merciful once. The lining was damp and clung to her shoulders like a skin of its own. She had no bag, no papers, only a thin scarf knotted around a teddy bear's neck and a thumb that kept finding the inside of her mouth for company. "Hey," Frank said, soft as a broom whispering across asphalt. He crouched so his face was near hers, but not overbearing. He had learned with Clare that fear made people small. You didn't look down at small people. You tucked yourself beside them. The child looked up with eyes too old for the body and too young for the world, eyes that had practiced endurance. They blinked at him the way someone might blink at a pulse that they were measuring for hope. "You lost?" He kept his voice plain. He wanted to say, "Where's your mother? Who left you?" But the rain taught patience. The town had taught him discretion. People didn't all want to be fixed by questions. Sometimes they wanted to be noticed. She shook her head. She had a name eventually, but at first she only held his sleeve and shivered. Frank unbuttoned his own jacket and slid it toward her. It smelled like oil and pipe smoke and a faint trace of engine grease. It smelled like a man who had slept in it more than once. "Come on," he said. "Let's get you dry." He did not call the police that night. Not then. Not with his own life perched on the edge of what if. Not with the shoebox of bills that would erupt into a world of questioning and forms and well-meaning strangers. He thought of Claire's eyes and how she had once fished coins from behind the cushions to buy 2 apples and offer one to a hungry friend. He thought of his hands. Hands that had learned to be careful with things that were breakable. He thought of the way the town sometimes swallowed people whole and chewed quietly. He wrapped the child in his jacket and carried her, half-draped, half-cradled, down to the bus shelter where his old truck waited. He drove with the heater on, and the radio turned off so the rain could be the endorsement of his choice. He told himself, in the intervals between the streetlights, that he would take her to the station in the morning. He told himself, like a litany, that there would be forms and maybe temporary placement, and a social worker with a clipboard, and the long, slow bureaucracy that could extract kindness and repackage it as paperwork. For now, he had her. For now, he had a small hand that fit into the length of his. When he opened his apartment door, Clare was awake on the couch, knees tucked to her chest, a math workbook splayed like a paper fan. She had a thermal blanket over her legs and a lamp that made a warm, lazy yellow pool. She looked up at him with the same quiet appraisal she used on bills and teachers and men who said sorry. "Who is she?" Claire asked without a tremor. "Found her at the bus stop," Frank said. He lowered the child into Claire's lap, like passing something precious and fragile. "She's cold. Didn't have a name." Claire's fingers were small and quick. She pulled the wet hair away from the child's forehead and checked for a fever. "She smells like rain," she said immediately, as if that were both diagnosis and poetry. "Do we know what to—" "No," Claire said, "but we can make cocoa." They made cocoa while the child drank and stared at the steam as though it might rearrange the world. Frank watched them, the way his daughter found patience like it was a spare blanket, and thought, "You cannot measure the size of a heart by your credit line." They named the child quietly in that first hour. Names make people belong in the world. Claire suggested Maya, then changed it to Maya Lou when the child opened her mouth and made a tiny protest as if in agreement with syllables. Frank liked keeping one name simple. He called her Maya when he adjusted the blanket and watched her sigh, fatigue lowering its eyelid like a curtain over a stage. That night, he made a decision that would, he suspected, be expensive in ways he couldn't count. He kept the child. He put a wet towel on the radiator, dried the shoes, and smoothed her hair. He told himself the morning would have a plan, and that plans sometimes needed to be invented on the fly. If kindness is an equation, then Frank's variables were mostly debts. He had a rent problem, a used truck with a recurring cough, Claire's braces in a year maybe. He had the city's minimum wage embedded in his bank ledger. He had the quiet knowledge that a man like him, who kept his head down and his broom moving, could be replaced without a town missing him. But he also had the habit of locating humanity in unlikely corners. That habit, the thing that insisted he pick up trash and tune his empathy like a small radio, told him he could not leave a child in the cold. "If this gets out," he said to the ceiling a map of small cracks, "they'll ask questions. They'll want to interview me. They'll want forms. They might make me suspicious, like I'm hiding something." "Then don't hide," Claire said, earnest in that searing way children can be. "Tell them the truth. She was outside. You brought her in. We warmed her. We can do that." Frank wanted Claire's faith to be a commodity he could spend on every night. He said nothing. He wrapped an extra blanket around Maya and sat on the edge of the sofa until the rain dulled to a tired drum. He listened to the house breathe, the radiator's Delphic clank, the oven's low hum, the small clock that marked the town's midnight like a heartbeat. By the time dawn scraped a thread of light beneath the blinds, he had rehearsed a dozen conversations he would avoid, and one he would have to have. He would call a neighbor for advice. He would call Donna Martha, who had once close to a nurse's memory and a heart that remembered all the town's orphaned sorrows. He would think of passing the child to the system and of Claire's steady face. He would think of what it meant to take on an extra mouth that needed feeding when his own ledger was already a poem of deficit. But night had a way of demanding courage. The morning had a way of evaluating it. If you believe small acts change destiny, leave a comment that says, "Destiny." Frank would have scoffed at a line like that if he'd heard it anywhere but now, sitting with coffee and a child who had finally stopped shivering. It felt absurd to imagine strangers on phones judging his tiny mercy. The thought was almost funny. He let it go. He kept his mouth shut about Maya when he pushed his broom through the factory lot that morning. The foreman, Landry, was already at the gate, the kind of man whose tie never truly looked ruffled in a storm. Landry counted things the way some men prayed, numbers and order, a devotion to balance sheets that left little patience for small human inconveniences. He nodded at Frank like a man marking a checkbox. "Big meeting today," Landry said. voice tuned flat. 10 o'clock, bring everyone in. It'll be quick. Fine, Frank said. He felt the broom in his hands like an old ally. He'd spent his nights sweeping the factory's perimeter, then spent days sweeping assembly lines for a contractor who prized speed over neatness. The factories had become a map of Brechtian shifts, human beings as cogs under fluorescent light. There was steel and fabric and the sound of looms like a distant ocean. Word traveled fast across the floor. Layoffs. Someone muttered the word like a prayer for something that would not come. The rumor spread with the velocity of hunger, first in the break room, then at the benches, then through the line where women and men who had fed kids and paid rent and learned to inherit the factory's rhythms began to imagine themselves unincorporated. Frank watched faces change. There was Rosa, who kept a jar of biscotti in a locker for anyone who forgot the morning. There was Ramirez, who laughed easily, but was the kind of man whose hands had earned their quiet. The factory was a body of small necessities and rhythm. A layoff here would rip a limb off that organism and expect the rest to keep walking. There's a memo, someone said, from Landry's office. They filed into a low auditorium with chairs like witnesses and a screen that had once been used to train new hires. Landry stood at the front. The room held its breath like a living thing in mourning. He said words that were careful and corporate, the kind that practiced empathy the way a salesman practices sincerity. Restructuring, he said. We are optimizing operations. Certain positions will be phased out. Severance packages will be discussed individually. A woman near Frank's shoulder pressed her fingers together until the knuckles whitened. A man in the back, a third-shift stitcher who mended his own family like he patched rips, cursed softly in a language that sounded like grief. Frank felt a hollow ache. He felt responsible for nothing and everything at once. He had a found child in his apartment and a daughter who probably suspected she'd been deputized as temporary nurse. He had a life that depended on a place that now called itself evolutionary. He thought of Maya's small hand and the way it had steadied on his sleeve. He thought of Claire's insistence. Tell the truth. He thought of Donna Martha's face and how neighbors sometimes became houses with windows that opened. At the back of the room, someone began to clap. Not in celebration, but the polite, nervous clap people use to fill silence. It sounded thin. And then the doors of the auditorium opened as if someone had decided the room needed an answer. He was wet. He had a briefcase that had survived better days and worse weather, the leather scraped with a kind of dignified neglect. When he walked in, he moved through the chairs like a man who had been trained to take up space without making noise, until he stood before the silence and looked around with the careful measure of someone who knew what the consequences of the day might be. Oliver Vance. The name had the weight of history in that town. He'd founded the mill when the town was a cluster of hopes. He'd stood in boardrooms where decisions planted futures and uprooted families. There were portraits of him in sepia behind glass, his hands folded like a man who trusted industry to secure the moral world. He had been away from the factory for years. Some said a trip to Europe, then a quiet withdrawal into other affairs. People said he lived on a hill with a garden, and a woman who left mornings for tea and didn't return some nights. He wore regret the way older men wear their suits, intentional folds, a pocket watch memory, an old man who wanted to be taken seriously. There were rumors that his days were measured now by pills and appointments. There were also stories of his hands being capable of generosity when he felt the right thing. He had not been to the floor since the last big restructuring. He came now like a storm with a different kind of thunder. Not the loud, explosive sort, but a presence that made people stop pretending the day hadn't just been rearranged. "Good morning," Oliver said, and his voice carried the kind of authority that had made people listen in the decades when the factory was a city of its own. He did not sit. He let his eyes move, not with the quick catalogue of a businessman assessing assets, but with something like remorse, It landed on faces and held. Frank watched him the way someone watches a landmark after it's been closed up for repairs. You know the lines, the edges, but there is a slight hitch in expectation when it moves. Landry had the sort of smile that fit a ledger. It elongated politely, but never stretched to the eyes. He stepped forward with a folder, as if to reclaim the stage he had booked. "Oliver," Landry said. The word was measured. "We were about to—" Oliver opened his battered briefcase with a decisiveness that suggested habit. He took out a single sheet of paper, and then another, and his hands were steady in a way that frightened Frank. He had seen men of means fade into confusion and then remaster themselves in endings. This was not that. This was a man who had come armed with facts and an unwillingness to let things go unexamined. "Before anyone speaks," Oliver said, and there was a shortness to his words that made the room hush. "I need to say something about dignity." It landed in the room like a definition. Dignity, in that moment, was a word that felt almost fossilized by corporate speech. People used it to dress up austerity. People said it when they wanted to make pain sound tasteful. Oliver's voice was not delicate. It held a sentence like a stone. "Dignity isn't negotiable," he said. The exact phrasing startled Frank, because it was a line he might have told his daughter in the dark when she was afraid. A line he had inherited in conscience, if not in etiquette. It was not a slogan, but a belief that vibrated against the room's cheap folding chairs. It made people feel the floor under them. Landry smoothed his tie. "Mr. Vance, with all due respect, the company is facing— You're announcing layoff numbers without accounting for the books," Oliver said quietly. He flipped the papers in his hand, and for the first time he looked like a man who lived with the consequence of his choices. "You made decisions with borrowed capital. There are loans that were never sanctioned by a board, lines of credit drawn without transparency. You stood at the center of a set of actions that put workers at risk to fortify the books for a short-term gain." A murmur swelled. The word fraud is a dangerous animal in a room full of people who have been living on the mercy of earned wages. It smelled like accusation, like the small town's appetite for spectacle. Landry's posture hardened. "That's a serious claim," he said. "And it's one that needs—" "It needs an audit," Oliver said. "We've already initiated one. I'm here because I am the owner who will not sign away the livelihood of these men and women while they are treated as numbers on a page." A man near Frank's shoulder let out a long breath, as if he had been holding it for weeks. A woman began to cry quietly. Someone else started to clap, slowly at first, like a heartbeat re-establishing itself. Frank's broom felt lighter in his hand for a beat, as if the factory's air had thinned. He had spent years seeing two sides of people, the tiny acts they could do when they were unseen, and the big, decisive ones that made headlines. He had not expected to hear a man like Oliver proclaim something that folded toward mercy. It was, in a strange way, the bravery Frank had used to tuck a child away for a night in his own apartment. Landry's face tightened like a fist. "You have no authority here to—" "I have every authority to protect what built this town," Oliver said. He put his hand on a chair back as he spoke. "And that includes the people who make the work possible." When he spoke, the briefcase on the floor seemed less a case and more a repository of decisions. Frank, who had seen enough of the world to know that money made many things happen and ruined others, watched as the layers peeled away. Oliver was not a caricature of villainous wealth or saintly contrition. He looked like a tired man who had realized that some of his own choices had corroded what he had intended to build. "Mr. Vance?" Landry said. The word was small and brittle. Oliver's hand rose and he tapped the papers. "There are irregular loans with our name. There are shell vendors. There are overlooked transfers. I don't know the whole picture yet, but I will not allow mass layoffs today when they are averted by correcting the ledger. We will audit. We will pause any action. And until that is done, no one here will be dismissed under this pretext." The room shifted like a living thing. People who had tightened their shoulders in anticipation of unemployment began to breathe like they might tomorrow. There was not a single miraculous solution, not a sudden injection of endless funds. There was, instead, a man who could order time to be taken so truth could be sought. Landry's jaw moved. "You don't understand the obligations on this company. I understand enough," Oliver said. "I understand the faces in this room. I built this place. I will be damned if I watch it hollow out because some people decided to profit from fear." There was a softness to his voice now, like a confession. Frank noticed the tremor in it and thought, regret colors even the oldest hands. He thought of his own small shelf of failure and how it sometimes looked like sacrifice. "Who are you to stop a business decision?" Landry demanded. Oliver folded his papers like a man folding a map he'd read too late. "I am the person who started this. I am also someone who has seen the cost of easy profit. If this company, the company I built, is going to survive, it will do so by remembering the people who are its heartbeat." The papers he had held fluttered to the floor like leaves. One of them, a thin sheet, was a list. Names, positions, numbers besides them where human faces had been reduced to cost centers. The word "phase out" was stamped in a font that made it sound surgical. Landry's hand reached for it reflexively. Oliver stepped forward and, to a collective sound in the room, reached out and ruffled the paper in a gesture that was equal parts theatrical and final. He did not tear it out of spite so much as to make a noise loud enough to end the ritual. "This is not how we treat people," he said. "If we are to be kept in the black, we will not do so by stripping dignity from the people who make this place real." Frank's heart knocked against his ribs in the old rhythm of attention. The broom felt like a relic of nights that had held other sorts of heroism, small acts of care, a jacket given to a shivering child. He had saved a child from the rain. That night had made him kin to other people who would choose the immediate human thing over the bureaucratic future. When the crowd filed out, some people clapped softly, some people argued, some people cried. Outside, the rain had stopped and left the world held in a damp, polished shine. Frank found Landry's jaw set, and his eyes on Oliver like a man confronting an old rival who'd come to rewrite the rules. "You're making a scene," Landry said, but the sound had lost its bite. "I'm making sure people have a chance," Oliver replied. "And until the books are straight, there will be no layoffs." Later, in a quieter corridor where conversation could be kept to whispers, Frank found Oliver leaning against a brick wall, the briefcase closed, like an old secret. Rain made small rivers off the roof and into the gutters. There was a closeness to the man now that had ripened from the public moment to the private. "You were on the road last night," Frank said, because it was true, and because there was a thin, honest way to begin everything. Oliver looked up with eyes that had been lit by years of decisions. "I was," he said. "Had some time to think. Got caught in the storm." "You were soaked," Frank observed. "You didn't look like a man who'd been out sightseeing." Oliver's hand tightened on the briefcase handle. "I wasn't," he said. "I came back because I couldn't let the legacy of this place be sold in quiet increments. I kept thinking of all the hands that kept the machines running. I kept thinking of what it cost them to feed their families." Frank thought of his own hands then, the ones that had swept the corners of the world and the ones that had tucked a child against a radiator. He thought of the briefcase, like a pregnant animal sitting between them. "What will happen now?" Frank asked. Oliver's face softened into something like a plan. "We audit," he said. "We pause any irreversible actions. We speak to the bank. We—" He paused as if the list of procedural things was a rope to be climbed. "We will do what we can, and I want someone from the floor involved, someone the workers trust. We need a liaison, Someone who can be the honest voice when my head is full of paper. Frank felt the air move inside his chest. A liaison. A voice. The town had not taught him to expect invitations to architecture. It had taught him the dignity of small work. It had also taught him to recognize when opportunity hid itself in a neighbor's offering. "Why me?" he asked. He had the sudden, private fear of a man who'd never had the world lean toward him. Oliver regarded him, and something like apology passed through his features. "Because you were there last night," Oliver said. "You picked up a man on a road. You did the thing that most people make convenient excuses about. People see that." It was a strange compliment. Frank felt both exposed and oddly honored. There was the undercurrent of a life about to become different in a way he could not yet measure. He could imagine his father in that moment, how his father had once insisted that a handshake mattered more than a check. He could imagine his daughter and the extra weight in her backpack, obligations and love springing together. "I don't know anything about audits," Frank said. "I know how to sweep." "Then you'll be the one to tell us what it means to have a voice," Oliver said. "You'll be the one who keeps me honest when I forget what the work looks like from the floor." Frank thought of Maya, of her small, warm body curled under his extra blanket, of the note he now carried like a secret behind his ribs. He thought of the list Landry had tried to read like scripture, names on a page about to be erased. He thought of Clare's faith in the world and how fierce it was. "Okay," Frank said finally. It was a word with edges. It was also a beginning. Oliver closed his briefcase and looked at him with gratitude, the way men sometimes offer it when they are making amends. "You're doing more than you know," Oliver said. "I haven't always believed that before. I think I'm learning." They shook hands like two men agreeing to a task, and the town's machinery began to hum with that small, dangerous expectation that change can carry, the sort that requires sweat and stubbornness. Frank walked back to the lot with new weight on his shoulders. The broom felt different now, tool and symbol. He had gone out in the rain to clear streets and come back with a child in his jacket and a promise that someone would listen. The cool fabric of his choice still tingled under his skin. He had not told anyone about Maya yet. He could imagine, in the hours ahead, the forms, the questions, the possible judgment. He wanted to avoid complications until Oliver's plan had time to breathe. There was a part of him that knew the town's appetite for gossip. There was also a part that believed people could surprise you by being kinder when held to account. When he turned the corner, he saw Clare and Maya through the second-floor window, doing a puzzle at the dining table. Maya had her tongue between her lips in concentration. Clare slid a piece into place and grinned. It was a small, domestic miracle. Two quiet people solving a shape together. Frank paused, let the moment sit against him, and walked up the stairs with the broom balanced against his shoulder. The day had begun to rearrange itself, and he could not tell if the rearrangement would make for better living or simply push the difficulties into new rooms. He only knew that the child at his table had opened a door he could not now close without breaking something inside himself. At the kitchen sink, he rinsed the dirt from his hands and found in the tiny curl of skin under his fingernail a piece of something that would not let him sleep. He used a sponge on the kettle and listened to the town outside reassume its ordinary noises. Buses, a dog that barked at the postman, a woman who called her son's name down the street. Later, when Landry's threats and Oliver's promises would weigh in the same scales, when auditors would come with clipboards and bankers would bring grey suits and carefully polite frowns, Frank would have to decide how many truths he could hold and which ones needed to be given away. But tonight was not a night for full truths. Tonight was the night of blankets and math homework done under lamplight and a small child who had stopped trembling. He washed his hands, dried them, and took a photograph from the mantel, a picture of Clare at 7, arms around a snowman that had barely been more than a lump, to the table. He looked at the faces and then at the sleeping form of Maya curled in Clare's arm. He set the photo down and said a quiet thing to himself that was both prayer and promise. I'll try to be enough. Outside, the town turned its water-stained face toward tomorrow. Inside, a small household held its breath between fear and hope. Frank sat for a while and listened to the kettle. He thought about the short list of things that could be done and the long list of things that could not. He thought about being a liaison, about telling bankers a human story they were paid not to care about. He thought about forms and weeks and the bewildering slowness of paperwork that could change a life. He also thought about one more thing: the briefcase Oliver had carried, and the list he had smoothed across his palm like an accusation and a remedy at once. There were men who would not give up their stolen gains without a fight. There were men who believed their profit was their right. There would be trouble. Trouble had feathers and claws, and there would be pain. He fed Clare and Maya toast that night, slightly burnt on one edge, with jam that had been a celebration once and a survival now. They ate together in a quiet that felt like the briefest truce in a city that rarely offered such luxuries. Clare told him a story about a class project. Maya listened like the whole world might hinge on the moral. Later, when the house had settled and the street lamps threw long metal fingers across the kitchen floor, Frank found the battered briefcase wickered into his thoughts again. It had become, in one day, both a symbol and a promise. He put his hand on the strap of his coat, on the small inside pocket where he kept the town's small certainties. His pay stub, a receipt from the dentist, a folded note Clare had given him that read, "Dad, you're the best." He touched it like a rosary of small reliquaries. Outside, a delivery truck sighed down the avenue. The factory's doors were lit like a line of watchful eyes. Inside, somewhere in a patient hospital or a house with many locked doors, Oliver Vance might be clearing his own conscience. Frank did not know the man well. He knew only that the man had used his voice publicly for something not self-serving that day. That was enough for a used broom and a shoebox of bills to feel the heat of possibility. There would be meetings. There would be papers. There would be someone who would try to make this day a brief hiccup in a campaign for power. There would be Landry, clever and dangerous. There would be bankers, slow and careful. There would be audits that smelled like stale ink and fluorescent light. There would be people who lost their balance. This is where Frank stood, at the threshold of a new kind of responsibility, with a found child under the covers and a daughter's trust like a compass. He had chosen once to keep a small life from the storm. He had agreed, with a hand that still trembled from the cold, to be a voice between the floor and the offices, between the people who stitched fabric and the people who counted it. The doorbell rang twice late that night, a nervous, hesitant sound. Frank went to open it and found, on the stoop, an envelope shoved under the mat and a note taped to the frame. It was written in a hand he didn't recognize, the sort of hand that belonged to someone who had practiced signatures long enough to make dying an art. It read only 3 words: "We need to talk." He folded the note carefully and took it inside. He told himself not to read omens into anonymous paper. He told himself that a town like theirs only ever learned the truth by making mistakes and then owning them. He lay awake with the sound of the radiator and the steady little breath of Maya in the next bed. He thought of Oliver's declaration and Landry's colors. He thought about how he had covered a child with a jacket and committed himself to a course he could not entirely foresee. The night held a long, thin possibility. He watched the streetlight through the slats of the blinds, and he felt a peculiar tenderness. If life was a ledger, he thought, maybe the entries worth keeping are not the ones a bank would understand. Maybe they are the ones that mean someone had warmth in their hands when the rain came. At dawn, When the town would wake to the fact that the factory was a battlefield of paper and conscience, Frank would step into the day with a broom and a new title that meant more than a name on a plaque. He would be a voice. He would be a guardian, in his own unglamorous way. He adjusted the blanket around Maya and smelled the slight tang of laundry soap. He kissed Claire's forehead, where she had slept, and steadied himself. The town was reinventing its stories, and he had been offered one he had not known he wanted. He had pulled up his sleeves for the night and hid his mercy in a warm coat. There was a hunger in that truth, practical, patient, and insistently human. Outside, the factory's tall chimney puffed a thin cloud into a sky that was trying to be polite about the morning. An envelope lay on the doormat like a small promise. A man on the other side of town, the owner, the one whose signature could move money like a tide, had decided the day would not end in quiet. That note on the doorstep might have been nothing. It might have been the wind. It might have been the polite threat of a man who wanted to be feared. For Frank, it was another small tremor under the skin of the town. He folded it into his pocket and went to work, broom over shoulder, the memory of the morning's faces still warm beneath his ribs. The audit began with a paper shuffle and a quiet fury. Oliver, once back at his modest office above the plant, had called a meeting with two people he trusted. A bank compliance officer named Clare Klein, who knew every regulation that could turn a fraud into a criminal case, and Marisol Vega, an internal auditor whom Landry had always thought too thorough for promotion. Frank sat with them, having been asked to come not because he read financial statements, but because he knew the floor, the people, and because Oliver wanted someone who would translate ledgers into human rhythms. They worked through the afternoon with an industrious, low-key desperation. Forms, copies, signatures matched against handwriting samples, vendor invoices that smelled of drywall and paint rather than widgets. The shell companies Landry had used were a taxonomist's dream. Names that invoked cranes and horizons, addresses that mapped to vacant lots, invoices that repeated like cheap poetry. Claire frowned until a line formed between her brows. Marisol was the kind of woman who could spot a lie in a ledger the way some people spot a smudge on a lens. "It's been worked to make it look procedural," Marisol murmured, tapping a document as if it might confess. "Same handwriting on approvals, same routing stamps, and look, these purchase orders refer to vendors that don't exist." Landing on that discovery felt like finding a door in a wall. The auditors called the bank and flagged transfers. The bank placed a temporary hold on suspicious accounts and alerted the compliance division. When Frank left the meeting to return to the floor, he felt the factory had become a living thing that breathed through paper and numbers. It was both more and less human than the people who fed it. Landry learned quickly that the walls were closing. He went from charm to rage in the space of an hour. His rhetoric, once careful and corporate, turned jagged. He began to speak louder in corners, to make phone calls in ways that let everyone hear his displeasure. He left that two-word note on Frank's door. Frank learned later, a clumsy attempt to intimidate the man the owner had singled out. As the audit widened, Landry retaliated not with subtlety, but with desperation. He sought out old files, tried to produce papers with forged letters of approval. He leaked a version of the layoff list to a local reporter, trying to force the hand of the board by making panic public. He convinced a weak-minded bank manager at a secondary branch to release a small tranche of funds. It looked for a moment like a quick profit. Payroll could be avoided by a series of glitches and silences. The town's air thickened. People began to gather in small knots near the break-room doors, whispering and waiting for the next blow. But Clare Klein's hold and Marisol's relentless cross-checking slowed the machine. The bank reversed the unauthorized release when internal compliance flagged inconsistencies. Clare coordinated with the regional bank office and, crucially, with the police. Paperwork had crossed into criminal territory. Landry's forged approvals were not elegant. They were clumsy enough for a handwriting analyst to notice. Marisol traced a string of invoices to a mailbox 3 towns over. A bank investigator traced a routing number to a shell account that had been receiving transfers on the same days payroll should have left the company. The chain of evidence, slow and precise, closed like a hand. On a grey afternoon, when the sky matched the factory's steel, 2 uniformed officers arrived and asked to speak with Landry. He had been expecting to be celebrated by now. Instead, he was escorted from his office in handcuffs, a man whose veneer of control flaked into bitter protests, and a plea that he had only followed orders. The workers watched from the shop floor, mouths open like people who had seen a sudden, improbable mercy. Ramirez slapped his palm against his chest, as if recalibrating his own pulse. The arrest did not fix everything. It did not refill accounts for any long term. It did not erase the months of anxiety, or the threats whispered over kitchen tables. But it did something the town had needed. It put an end to one kind of bad faith. A small, lawful thing had been allowed to happen, and that made room for something else. Planning, negotiation, the long arithmetic of repair. Oliver insisted that the factory needed immediate help beyond legal intervention. Certain creditors had to be reassured. Suppliers who accepted late payments for years needed to be paid to keep stitches from unthreading into chaos. He had, the auditors found, a reserve fund he had not announced publicly, not a fortune, not enough to cure every wound, but a reserve built over decades that could buy the company time. It was his, and he wanted it used where it mattered. Payroll, small supplier balances, emergency maintenance. He did not see it as charity, but as the smallest matter of basic stewardship. But the decision took its toll. Oliver's chest tightened increasingly as the day stretched. At first, he attributed it to stress. Later, to urgency. When Clare Klein took him to a small lounge off the boardroom and suggested he see a doctor, he waved her away with a practiced smile and a hand that trembled more than the pain he would admit. He wanted to be useful until the end. That was his nature. People have to be paid, he told Frank in a low voice that had the distance of someone who'd measured regret for years. It will take time, but it will buy us time. Frank watched the color retreat from Oliver's face like ink pulled from water. He was no stranger to pain. He had felt it up close in a different register, but he knew the look of a man who had not finished making amends. He wanted to tell Oliver to sit, to breathe, to let others finish the work. But Oliver's hands were steady with the same resolve that had once built factories and jobs. The briefcase, always between them like an animal waiting to be petted, lay open on a table as Oliver signed documents. Oliver arranged for transfers and for direct letters to suppliers. He set up a temporary payroll account, instructed the bank to release funds for severance should it be needed later, and created an emergency fund to repair machinery so that production would not falter. Most of it was mundane, procedural, legal, things that required signatures and small, careful choices. Little by little the town's breathing eased. People who had been ready to pack their tools began, reluctantly, to imagine another month. Then Oliver experienced a deeper tightening in his chest, a pressure that felt like a fist closing around his sternum. It was angina, the doctors later told them, a symptom of coronary artery disease that could be controlled, but that might also herald something worse. He told Claire and Marisol that he would go to the hospital. He insisted Frank ride with him. "I don't need to be fussed over," he said, but his voice lacked its usual steadiness. When Frank looked at him, the man's composure had a threadbare quality that made Frank angry for him. At the hospital, tests were quick. EKG, blood work, a set of images that showed places where arteries were narrowed. Doctors spoke in soft tones about procedures and risk. Oliver lay back and considered his life as one considers an old ledger, line by line. He told the doctors he had no patience for drama, only for solutions. The cardiologist recommended immediate intervention. Oliver agreed with the odd, ironic lack of fear that made him seem both practical and brittle. Frank stayed in the waiting room while Oliver went into the cath lab. He held Maya on his lap, who had become used to hospital lighting, to the pale, efficient smell of antiseptic, and to the small plastic cups of juice. Claire sat beside him, her fingers tapping a rhythm on the paper cup, like a small, earnest drum. They were all in the bright, anxious hush, subsidiary to a larger event. Frank watched faces move through the room, workers from the floor, people who'd known Oliver from a different era, neighbors like Donna Martha who had come with a homemade casserole and something like a prayer. When Oliver emerged, pale and bandaged, the doctors were careful with words. "He had a significant blockage," one said. "We opened it. He did well. We'll keep him under observation." That afternoon, Oliver insisted, with the faint stubbornness of someone making amends, on finishing the paperwork. He did it over the phone from his bed, dictating trust instructions and legal language. He wanted the employees to know that the board would not abandon them. He wanted to formalize a plan where an employee trust would hold a portion of company shares, a cooperative would manage day-to-day operations with oversight, and a verified liaison, Frank, would be the human bridge between floor and office. The idea was not to overthrow capital, but to bind it to a concrete responsibility. There were legal teams. There were signatures done in the sterile light of a hospital room. There were digital transfers authorized and countersigned. Clare, Klein, and Marisol arranged for a meeting with a representative from the bank who agreed, after seeing the evidence and after verifying signatures, to release a provisional line of credit tied to Oliver's personal funds. The bank would require certain covenants. The lawyers would write them up. None of it was instantaneous, but Oliver's actions made it possible for the company to take a breath. Frank watched those exchanges and felt a strange kinship with the man who had said earlier that dignity isn't negotiable. That line sat now like a hinge on the day. He thought about the child under his coat that stormy night, about the way small mercies had rippled outward. He thought of the list in Oliver's briefcase, and how quickly a man could make amends if he chose to use his power that way. Oliver's condition worsened overnight. He had been brave in his declarations and diligent in his choices, but the heart's decisions are sometimes unbending. In the early hours, as the hospital hushed and monitors clicked in a rhythm like a small mechanical heartbeat, Oliver smiled at Frank and took his hand. "You did a good thing," Oliver said, voice thin but steady. "Not just for me, for them, for this town." Frank, who was not trained in worldly consolations, found an answer that was not grand. "You did what you could." They spoke then, in the direct quiet of two men who had been cornered by regret and time. Oliver told him about the early years, how ambition had been a compass he misread, how he had loved the factory more than the people he had around him sometimes, how he had thought profit would be the measure of sake. He admitted to choices he regretted. He asked that someone steer the company into hands that wouldn't forget the people. "Find my boy," Oliver said suddenly, the words soft as paper. "Gavin. Tell him I've been a fool." Frank didn't know what that might mean for Gavin, who had vanished from the family's orbit. He only knew what an apology did for someone who had been unused to offering them. He promised to try. In the morning, Oliver's condition worsened. What began as angina gave way to a heart attack that the staff described as acute and severe. They did everything medicine could offer: emergency cath lab work, medication, the logic of modern interventions. Frank sat in a corridor lit like a theatre and held nothing but a steady breath. He called Donna Martha, who came and put both of her hands on his shoulders as if to anchor him. "He is a stubborn old man," she said softly. "But he has put things right." Oliver's last hours were not cinematic in the old sense. They were small and human. He had the people he wanted around him. He took Frank's hand, looked at Claire and Maya, and said something about small acts. He asked Frank to look after the factory as if it were a child. Gentle, stern, unafraid to do the right thing. He asked that Frank, who had saved a tiny life from the ditch, be allowed the resources to be a guardian now that the town might give him support. Make them matter, Oliver whispered. Not as charity, as necessity. Those were his last words that mattered to Frank. Then the monitors sketched their mechanical line into silence. The room's oxygen and lights and people could not change the biological fact. Oliver died in the hospital, his face arranged by sorrow and the small piece of someone who had, in his final months, attempted to balance a ledger he had once thought invincible. The town mourned him in a way that felt like a furnace cooling. The factory lowered flags, and workers set aside tools and came to a small service at the plant cafe. People who had worked under fluorescent light for decades came forward to tell stories. Of Oliver's temper, sure, but also of his generosity in hidden seasons. A memorial photo was set up, a plain, honest portrait in which he looked tired but resolved. Frank stood near it and thought of the briefcase, now closed, that had been a repository for so many choices. Gavin Vance came to the service with a guitar slung over his back and a stranger's apology folded into his face. He was thinner than the photographs Oliver had in albums. He had the hands of a man who had lived without the conveniences of legacy. He was a music teacher at a small school several towns away, his life full of other people's children and their sudden, bright questions. He had been estranged for years, and when he arrived, he walked with the hesitant dignity of someone who had rehearsed remorse in the mirror. He did not make a speech at first. He sat in the back and listened as people spoke. He watched the workers in the front row, who had known Oliver both as the founder and as the man who was learning at the end. He waited until the wake felt like a shared breath. Later, when they were left to the funeral parlor's quieter rooms, Gavin approached Frank. He had a humbleness that made him immediate and real. "My father. He didn't call me enough," Gavin said, voice small. "I know that. He called me this time in his last months. We talked. He asked me something about the factory, about not letting it become a place that chewed through people's lives. He asked me if I would help." Frank looked at him and saw a man who had been asked to carry a legacy he had avoided for years. He understood, in an instant, why a man who taught children to sing might run from the ledger's demands. The town had once defined success as ownership. For Gavin, it meant being present. "You don't have to do anything you don't want," Frank said quietly. Gavin smiled, not a famous smile, but a true one. "I don't know anything about managing a plant," he admitted, "but I know about listening. Maybe that's what it needs." Before the will was read, there were meetings with lawyers and the bank. The trust Oliver had written in those last days came to light. It was not a simple handover. He had lettered a structure that would give the employees a real stake. A worker cooperative would receive a significant block of voting shares to be managed by a trust, a board with fiduciary responsibility. The bank would release Oliver's funds to cover short-term obligations conditional on those covenants being met. The will named Gavin as the legal heir, but contained provisions that respected Oliver's last choices. The cooperative was to be supported, and Frank, who had proved himself a voice of the floor, would be given operational authority as plant manager and a seat on the trust board. It was a compromise between old money and new responsibility. Gavin read the will, an awkward ritual made intimate, and after consideration made a decision that surprised some and delighted others. He signed a document declining to take day-to-day control and instead offered personal funds to assist with startup costs for the cooperative and the legal steps necessary to transition shares. "My father tried a lifetime to teach me how to be a man," Gavin told the group later, eyes soft and vulnerable. "I learned most of it by watching him try to keep the factory alive. I'm going to try another way. I will teach them music, and I'm going to help." With Gavin's support, and with the bank's conditional funding and Clare Klein's oversight, Frank had a real chance to take the reins. There were legal meetings that seemed to last forever. Trust documents, bylaws for the cooperative, worker votes, reviews by council. The town's lawyers said the process could take months. Oliver's mandate and the bank's compliance allowed for provisional measures that let payroll continue and gave the cooperative time to organize. The arrangement was clear about one thing. The workers would have a voice, and the company would not treat them as numbers for short-term profit. During these weeks, Frank's life changed in small, human increments. He walked the floor and heard stories. Husbands and wives, fathers and mothers. People who had once imagined leaving, but had been given reason to stay. He called families together in the break room to explain the trust and listen to their fears. He sat with Rosa and Ramirez, with a dozen others, and learned negotiation in the way that matters. By listening first. The new arrangement required that Frank take some training, management classes, basic accounting workshops paid for by the trust. He learned the names of suppliers he'd never heard spoken, the cadence of payroll, the legal texts that seemed dry until he realized what they protected. He learned to temper his instincts with procedure. He learned that a liaison must sometimes be patient as well as loud. While the cooperative was being organized, the question of Maya's future pressed like weather on his roof. Social services had been notified sooner, as their involvement was inevitable once a child had been sheltered by someone who wasn't immediately a legal guardian. Frank had kept Maya initially because he could not bear the thought of a cold night and a stranger's hands. After Oliver's death and the legal adjustments at the plant, the question of permanency became urgent. The system's process could not be hurried without risking impropriety. Frank understood that, and did not want to become a man who thought his heart exempted him from law. But Oliver's will had provisions that could help. In his last days, Oliver had made direct notes about securing Maya's future. He had instructed his lawyers to set aside funds, a small trust earmarked for the child's care, contingent on a court's approval of Frank's guardianship. Gavin, feeling the pull of reconnection, offered to help expedite a lawful route to adoption. The lawyers, the bank, and the social worker, all cautious professionals, agreed that while a full adoption might be a matter of months, they could support a plan. Immediate guardianship for Frank backed by Oliver's funds and ongoing legal assistance, a home study to establish suitability, and community letters of support to demonstrate stability. The home study was thorough. Ms. Patel, the social worker assigned to the case, visited Frank's apartment and met Clare and Maya. She looked with a professional eye at the bedrooms and the food in the pantry, and the small framed photos that marked the life of a man with a daughter. She asked questions. What were Eve's routines? How did Frank discipline? How did he plan financially? She observed Clare's rapport with Maya and watched them play. Clare's patience in particular impressed her. She also asked Frank about his job prospects, which led Frank to tell the story of the cooperative in humble terms. He did not mention Oliver's funds as a way to buy approval. He mentioned them as a way to ensure Maya's welfare. Donna, Martha, and Rosa wrote letters. Ramirez came in with a jar of biscotti and a statement that said, without flourish, that Frank was a man who would not leave a child in the rain. Gavin wrote a letter as well, short and sincere. An offer of emotional support and a promise to provide for the child's future education in part. Clare Klein provided legal documents that established the provisional trust release so that housing improvements could be made and schooling arranged. The social worker's report, when it was written, said Frank's home was adequate, that he showed motivation to provide, and that Clare's role as a sibling made for a stable environment. There was a note of professional caution. Long-term adoption required time. The system could be patient if the child had a safe place. There were days of waiting that felt like a test. Each bureaucratic step required signatures and time. Frank learned patience the way other men learned a trade, by doing it and watching the slow improvement. He found himself teaching Maya small things in the interim: how to sweep a path without missing the edges, how to count change, how to butter toast without tearing it. He taught her to whistle with one finger at first, and she took to it like someone finding a new language. They made a ritual of buying a single crayon at the corner shop and labeling it "a day that counts." Clare taught her simple arithmetic with a patience that made Frank's chest hurt with gratitude. The community, which had been tentative in its earlier gossip, shifted to a different kind of watchfulness. People brought over second-hand books and old toys. A teacher from the local school came by and offered to enroll Maya in a nearby class, assuring her that the school had counselors who could help. Ramirez came on Saturdays to teach the kids some basic woodworking. He made a small stool for Maya that now sits by the window where she places her teddy each night. In the factory, the cooperative's early meetings were messy and miraculous. Workers who had been conditioned to accept orders had to learn to speak for themselves, to draft bylaws, to elect representatives. There were debates about wages and about the hours and about how to distribute a limited fund for maintenance. Some wanted immediate raises, others wanted the reserves saved for capital expenses that would keep machines running. The disagreements were honest and sometimes loud. Frank learned that leadership was less a matter of holding power than shepherding conversation toward consensus. He learned to listen to Rosa's quiet pragmatism and to Ramirez's economical impatience. He learned to occasionally make hard decisions with the counsel of the entire group. Landry's trial followed. The evidence was clear enough for indictment. He contested the charges, as most men do. His defense was that he had acted in the company's financial interest. The legal system moved at its own pace, but in a small courtroom, the truth of the forged documents was exposed. Landry's conviction for fraud and embezzlement was not an extravagant victory. It was a small justice. He served time, and his public profile was reduced to a cautionary tale about the cost of greed. Months slid forward, some warm, some wet. The bank's provisional funding allowed the cooperative to retool a press and to secure a new order that steadied cash flow. Gavin visited more often. He would bring a guitar and sit with Mara's music class, teaching children to harmonize as a way to teach them to listen. He began to reconcile with the fact that his father's hands had not always been the hands he wanted, that men can be both builders and destroyers of family. Music, he seemed to suggest, could be a bridge. When the court finally heard the adoption petition, the room was small and filled with people who had become family in indirect ways. Neighbors, co-workers, the bank's compliance officer, who had come despite her busy work schedule, fired from her sense of duty more than from formality. The judge, a woman with salt in her hair and a patient face, asked Frank a few direct questions about his relationship with Maya, about his finances and his support network, about the schooling and the plan for the girl's future. People spoke up on Frank's behalf. Clare, with the honest fervor that only an 11-year-old could muster. Rosa and Ramirez with their steady testimonies. Gavin with a short but heartfelt assurance. "It's clear the child has been loved since she arrived," the judge said, and the words landed like a benediction. The judge described the conditional nature of the transfer and the necessary legal formalities that would follow. There were remaining steps, final background checks, a briefed hearing, signatures, but the court's tone shifted toward blessing rather than suspicion. In the registry office a week later, with a small crowd around them, and with a clerk saying the formal words that make history into paperwork, Frank signed the adoption papers. The formality was short. The meaning was enormous. Maya took to her new name the way a child takes to sunlight, immediate and unhesitating. They made a small party afterward, more of a potluck than a celebration, at the factory's courtyard. Workers brought cakes and savory pies. Children ran under the engines of a machine that had been silenced for a demonstration and now hummed like a benign beast. Gavin played a melody on his guitar, and the chorus, faint but there, joined in. Oliver's portrait hung nearby, a quiet witness. In the months that followed, Frank's life filled with steady routines and small, deep joys. He rose to the job with a mixture of humility and stubbornness. There were meetings, many of them, discussions about supply chains and quality control and the human elements of factory work. He instituted a small fund for emergency childcare because he had watched too many days where a parent couldn't make it to the floor for a child's fever. He encouraged transparency in payroll and insisted on regular worker meetings where grievances could be aired before they festered. The cooperative's governance was imperfect but alive, and where there was imperfection, there was room to repair. Maya grew in a way that only children do. Her vocabulary expanded. Her curiosity became a habit. She learned to sweep alongside Frank, her small broom a companion to his larger one. He taught her to notice the edges of things, the places where dirt gathered like a truth. He took her to a small thrift store and let her pick out a coat. She resisted the compulsion to pick the brightest one until Frank reminded her that warmth mattered. She began to sing in Gavin's informal music sessions, her voice a bird trying to find its pattern. Clare, now 12 and finding the steady commitments of adolescence, took to tutoring Maya. The two girls built a repertoire of jokes and secret codes. Clare's patience matured into a fierce protectiveness. Sometimes Frank watched them and felt the world settle like a well-made bed. Donna Martha kept being Donna Martha, delivering soup, calling with medical advice, knitting when the winter was long. She accompanied Frank to a few board meetings as a neighbor and moral conscience. She carried no illusions about the difficulty of life. She only believed that people should be treated decently at every turn. There were tough days. Machinery broke when they could least afford it. A contract evaporated in a distant city and left the plant scrambling. A worker's illness required a difficult accommodation. But each setback felt now like a problem to be solved by a community rather than an edict from above. The cooperative had a tempering wisdom. They saved where it mattered, invested in safety, and refused to treat layoffs as a first strategy. The town regained a small dignity, and with each paycheck that arrived on time, dignity translated into groceries and rent and a child's art supplies. Frank learned to reconcile the humbling parts of leadership with the dignity he had always believed in. He did not revel in authority. He did not forget the nights sweeping in the rain. He carried the memory of Maya's small hand in his palm like a compass. When decisions came that could make a person's life fragile, he asked, "What preserves dignity?" The question, which Oliver had voiced once, became his litmus. Life, however, kept reminding him of fragility. There were moments of sorrow. A worker who had been there for 30 years retired because of illness. A family lost a home for reasons unrelated to the factory. Frank found himself sitting in kitchens with people who had been his colleagues, passing a cup of tea in quiet listening. He learned that leadership was, at its core, grief management, making practical what heartbreak could not be allowed to ruin. Gavin, whose quiet presence had become as much a resource as any legal fund, taught music classes at the school and at the plant. He organized an end-of-year recital where the children of the town performed pieces that sounded like weather, some cheerful, some melancholy. The concert raised money for a small scholarship fund for technical training at the factory. At night, Gavin, once estranged and remote, came to the apartment and sat on the stoop with Frank, sometimes in silence. "You did good," he said one night, voice low enough that the neighbors would not overhear. Frank felt it like a small, hot coal, a thing that burned but also warmed. "We did what we could," he said, and the "we" wrapped them both. A year after the storm, the factory's production had steadied, and the cooperative had found a rhythm. The trust Oliver had ordered had become a tangible mechanism for worker safety and investment. The bank's compliance officer, Clare, came back for a factory tour and was shown a repaired press, a new safety rail, and a small classroom where technical training was offered.
She smiled once at Frank, as if to say that the dryness of paperwork had sometimes produced a good harvest.
One late autumn night, the town experienced a brief shower, the kind that made the pavement shine without the violence of spring storms. Frank was walking home from a meeting with the cooperative board, his coat buttoned up, a folder tucked under his arm. He detoured down Meridian for no reason other than habit, walking the stretch he'd once swept for 8 years. The streetlights made the rain into molten gold, and for a moment he felt the weight of a life he'd never planned for and had been given anyway. Ahead of him, by the bus shelter where he'd first found Maya, a young man sat on the bench with his head down and a backpack at his feet. His shoes were soaked. He looked like many people he had seen, quiet, distant, searching for a place to land. The man's hands were tucked in his sleeves as if to keep the cold away. Frank felt the old, innate reaction rise in him. To keep walking, to let the world be. The city was large and needed folks who kept their heads down. But the memory of a small, shivering child in a shelter a year ago shaped his steps. He stopped, bent, and offered his umbrella without thinking of the careful arithmetic of his time. "You okay?" he asked. The young man looked up, startled, as if he had been unmoored. He had the vague, tired look of someone who had slept badly for a long while. He shook his head, and then almost smiled. "Lost," he said, as if it was more honest than fine. Frank sat down on the bench beside him and opened his umbrella like a small private roof. It kept the rain from their shoulders for a moment, and the town's sounds swelled around them. The young man said his name, Eli, and explained that he'd come to town looking for work and had nowhere to go that night. He wasn't asking for money. He was asking for a direction. Frank listened. He offered a thermos of coffee. He offered a spare blanket from his trunk, the same one that had been used months before. He offered, finally, what had been offered to him, a seat at a table. "We have a kitchen," Frank said. "We have a couch that creaks. We have hands that can teach you how to hold a broom or a tool. We have a bed that is not perfect, but it's warm." Eli's eyes filled with something that might have been gratitude and might have been relief. He stood slowly, as if surprise had taught his bones a new etiquette. "You sure?" he asked. "I don't want to be a burden." Frank thought of his own small ledger, the rent due, the braces on the horizon, the work of a cooperative trying to keep a machine oiled and people fed. He thought of the child's small hand that had once clutched his sleeve in the rain, and of Clare's face carrying patience like a shield. He thought of Oliver's last insistence that dignity was not negotiable, and of Anita's wavering in the shadows. "Sit with us for a night," he said. "We'll see by morning. If you want work, we can find something for you on the floor. If you don't, we'll call the shelter. But you're not alone tonight." Eli hesitated, then nodded. The umbrella tilted. The rain found the gutter, and for a moment the world seemed less like a ledger and more like a conversation. Frank took his arm and guided him back down Meridian toward the little apartment where Clare would meet them at the door with a surprised face that quickly softened into hospitality. Maya peered from the doorway. Teddy clutched and smiled. An untrained, immediate, honest smile that said everything by refusing to explain it. That night, when they had bread and soup, and the light pooling over the table, Frank thought of how small acts continued to ripple. He thought of the briefcase that had been a repository of choices, of Oliver's late corrections, of Landry's fall. He thought of the cooperative's awkward, ongoing work. He thought of the legal papers that had changed Maya's life and had allowed him to become a guardian. He understood, more clearly than ever, that goodness had no single shape. At the window he looked out at Meridian's wet sheen, the streetlight haloed like a halo. He felt the familiar, domestic hush of his apartment and realized that his role had shifted from sweeper to steward. He had always been a little of both, the man who cleared the visible mess, and now the man who took responsibility when the town's machinery failed to protect the small people inside. He said a quiet thing to himself that had the quality of a vow and the modesty of survival. I will try to be enough. In the weeks that followed, Eli found work at the plant, first on odd jobs, and then, with the help of training sessions, as a maintenance assistant. The cooperative offered him a path towards skills and regular hours. He found a small room above a bakery and began to make rent. He kept in touch, bringing in loaves from time to time as thanks. People who were helped tended over time to become helpers. Frank kept sweeping the corner he always had, but now he swept it with more company. The broom's bristles gathered the same things: gum, wrappers, small tokens of a city's nighttime life, but they also swept up the footprints left by children running home, by neighbors visiting, by strangers finding a place to stay. The broom had become a prop in a life that had altered course. There were sometimes nights when Frank sat on the stoop and listened to the factory hum and felt the memory of that first violent storm. He thought about the night he found a child, about the briefcase and the man who had returned to correct errors, about the man whose failures had been deep and whose attempts at repair were genuine. He thought about the unpredictability of kindness and how often it began as a small, solitary decision. At a workers' meeting one evening, a woman named June stood up to speak. She had been with the factory for 21 years and had watched many changes come and go. She cleared her throat and addressed Frank and the board with a steady gaze. "A year ago," she said, "some of us were ready to leave. We were afraid. Today we have a place to work, a say in how we do it, and a manager who will listen. We have food for our kids. We are torn and patched and still standing." There was a murmur of agreement, and beneath it, something like affirmation. In that room, dignity had become a verb. The town, over time, grew less brittle. People began to show up for one another in ways both small and practical. The bakery offered a discount to anyone who worked at the factory. The school arranged for a community counselor to join after-school programs. The local bank changed its lending philosophy to encourage small manufacturing, prompted by Clare's reports that showed responsible local investment could be stabilizing. On a morning that was not remarkable in any way but for its ordinary peace, Frank woke with the smell of toast and a sunlight that had no edge. Maya bounded into the kitchen, hair in a twist, and spilled her cereal in a way that made Clare laugh and made Frank reach for the paper towel. The house was full, noisy in that precise way that meant it was inhabited and not merely occupied. He had moments, still, when he would stand at the window and think of Oliver, how the man had left a complicated wake, and of the small ledger he kept in his head, what he owed and what he had been given. Sometimes he would whisper Oliver's line to himself, and then change the words. "Dignity isn't negotiable," he would say, and hear it echo back with the certainty of a bell. One afternoon, near the anniversary of that first storm, the town held a modest dedication at the factory. The cooperative unveiled a plaque honoring workers past and present, and a small garden planted beside the loading dock. People attended in work boots and clean shirts, with children running about and with baskets of food. Someone read a piece of Oliver's last testament aloud. Gavin, who had become more present, played a soft melody on his guitar. Frank stood by the plaque with his hand on Maya's shoulder, and when the crowd applauded, she clapped in a way that was both shy and proud. Afterwards, as the sky lightened and the streetlights blinked out, Frank walked home under a new calm. The street smelled faintly of dust and bread, and the small comforts of a town that had been through something and come out, guileless and repaired. He had not become a man of power overnight. He had become an honest one, which in its way asked more and glittered less. He passed the bus shelter where he had first found Maya and glanced down the road. A car drove by, scattering puddles. He realized then that the world had not changed its rules. Storms still came. But the town had changed enough. There were more hands to pull people out of water. There were agreements that made survival collective instead of solitary. There was a man who swept the corner, and a child who would one day sweep beside him, perhaps in a different capacity. He continued walking, feeling the small ache of a life that was both ordinary and extraordinary. The broom now leaned against a wall in the back of the shop, like a friend that had been known for years. He had a desk, a new title, and the particular fatigue of someone who had been given responsibility for more than just his own survival. Later that night, when the rain came down in a rhythm like the first night but gentler, Frank's coat was on his shoulders, and his way home was a path he'd learned. He walked more carefully now, aware of the puddles and the footprints people had left. He thought about the road he had taken, a path that had begun as a job in the damp and became a vocation when someone needed shelter, and felt a deep, patient gratitude. At the bus shelter, a teenager fumbled with a soaked backpack and a folded letter, looking as bewildered as Frank had been that first storm. Frank's hand, without thought, slid into his pocket for an umbrella. He stopped and offered it like a small truce. "Need a hand?" he asked. The boy looked up, eyes like someone who'd been waiting for permission to be seen. He nodded, and Frank stood in the rain with him for a moment, the umbrella a modest roof, the light making the raindrops into brief ornaments. The boy said his name was Marco. He'd come to the town to look for work. He had a cousin who could pay him once he had bus fare. He had, like so many, been bruised by life's logic, and was not asking for the right answer so much as someone to share the problem. Frank thought of the note that had once been taped to his door, "We need to talk," and of all the many ways people asked for help. He thought of the small book of bills under his bed, and of the trust Oliver had left to ease a path. He thought of Maya, asleep now in the next room, and of Clare's carefree snore. He thought of a world that could sometimes be changed by the small insistence of a stranger's hand. "Come on," he said. "There's a kitchen not far from here. We have toast. We have a couch. We can figure out what comes next." He held the umbrella over both of them and walked Marco back toward the lights of Meridian. The rain washed the sidewalk clean, and in the simple silver of the streetlight, Frank felt something settle. The town had learned a modest truth, that mercy, when matched with accountability, could be the most practical policy. At the kitchen table, with 3 bowls and a candle that had been a gift after Oliver's passing, Frank looked at the life he had and the life he had chosen. He had once measured his worth in what he swept away. Now he measured it in what he held near and what he refused to hand over to the ledger's cruelty. He could not promise miracles. He could not guarantee that storms would not come again. He could promise only that if a small life appeared at his door, he would not walk by. His palm found Maya's when she reached across the table to steal jam, and Clare laughed softly. Gavin's guitar sang from the couch. The cooperative was ironing out rules. The bank's compliance officer had become, quietly, a friend. Ramirez and Rosa and Donna Martha got up from their chairs to tidy plates and exchanged the day's gossip. Life, messy and persistent, continued. Frank rose at last and went to the window. The rain slowed to a memory, and the streetlight drew a halo on the wet pavement. He felt the worn weight of the broom in his mind and the heavy, honest weight of a child's hand in his actual hand. He thought about the way one night had changed everything. A storm, a bus shelter, a man who kept sweeping. He thought about dignity and about how it had cost Oliver his reputation but had bought the town a chance. He thought about how a briefcase could hold both accountability and regret. He thought about Landry's greed and the workers' courage. He thought about the precariousness of all arrangements and about the stubbornness of human kindness. Outside, a car passed and threw water into the gutter. Frank turned from the window and found Maya standing behind him, eyes solemn with a child's insight. She reached up and hugged him without asking permission, as if that now sure act could anchor both of them. He hugged her back and whispered, "You're home." She breathed him in and let go and ran back to the table to grab a cookie. He laughed, a small sound that had the quality of relief. When he later stepped outside to sweep the corner before bed, a ritual he kept as a reminder of where he had started, he paused in the rain and looked down the road. A man swept the way he always had, but he stopped to help, to listen, to shelter. He was no longer only a street sweeper. He was the forgotten guardian who had been found by chance, who had found a child, and who had, through the slow arithmetic of courage and community, adopted a way of life that honored dignity. If someone reading this remembers a night of rain and a child's small shoes, maybe they'll remember too that the smallest acts can alter a town's fate. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that kindness matters. Subscribe for more stories like this.